As we continue our week-long quest for new profiles and courage, we're pleased to welcome Jonah Goldberg, one of America's top political commentators and the co-founder and editor-in-chief of The Dispatch. As a speaker and writer, Mr. Goldberg helps audiences appreciate the essential nature of politics by examining the underpinnings of liberal and conservative ideologies, economic policy, and the changing role of modern-day media. A fellow at the National Review Institute and the American Enterprise Institute, Mr. Goldberg is the author of 3 New York Times bestsellers, including 2018's Suicide of the West: How the Rebirth of Tribalism, Populism, Nationalism, and Identity Politics is Destroying American Democracy. He is also a weekly columnist for the Los Angeles Times and the host of the popular podcast, The Remnant, with Jonah Goldberg. Mr. Goldberg will be engaged in conversation this morning by Nancy Gibbs, director of the Shorenstein Center and the Edward R. Murrow Professor at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. She is the former editor-in-chief of Time magazines. Most importantly, at least for us, Miss Gibbs is a lifelong Chautauquan, thanks to her mother, Janet Gibbs, who made her concert debut as a pianist with the Chautauqua Symphony Orchestra. Nancy and her brother, Christopher, grew up at Club and both work for our newspaper, the Chautauquan Daily. Nancy is a summa cum laude graduate of Yale and has a degree in politics and philosophy from Oxford, where she was a Marshall Scholar. In addition to the numerous nonprofit boards on which Nancy serves, she currently sits on the Chautauqua Institution Board of Trustees. Christopher, her brother, is a former trustee, and their father, Howard, was chair of the board from 1978 to 1985. It is our honor to host Mr. Goldberg this morning on his first visit to Chautauqua, and Nancy in the latest of many appearances on this stage. Today is made possible by the Reginald and Elizabeth Linné Lectureship in Business and Economics. Please join me in offering a warm Chautauqua welcome to Jonah Goldberg and Nancy Gibbs.
Thank you, Jeff. And welcome, Jonah. I want to add just one crucial detail about Jonah, who I never met before this morning, but I follow him on Twitter, so that's the same thing. Come for the insights, stay for the dogs. Yeah. Jonah, Chautauquans take our dogs very seriously, and your daily updates on the doings of Pippa and Zoe so captures their joy and devotion that I long ago concluded that you are 9 parts heretical conservative, 1 part canine. Before we leave Twitter, most importantly for our purposes this morning, the Duke University Polarization Lab has a bipartisan leadership board that keeps track of who on Twitter has the most followers from across the aisle. I don't know if you know this, you rank number 2.
Do I really?
Yes. Number 1 is Carlos Lozado, the book critic for the Washington Post, who is a genius, but he also has about 1/10 as many followers as you do.
Fascinating. I honestly did not know that.
Well, this speaks to the proposition that even, maybe especially in these very divided times, there are a lot of people who are interested in what you have to say. Chautauquans are deeply, genetically curious people, and so I'm very excited to welcome you here to deepen and broaden our conversation. We have to start with the news, which was not really news to anyone that we woke up this morning to find that Liz Cheney had lost by a huge margin her primary race in Wyoming. And many of us who, whatever feelings we might have had about the Cheney family, about Liz Cheney's politics, have watched her in this past year as an extraordinary figure. And so I'd like to start with what you make of her and what she has done and what she does from here. Sure.
First of all, I want to say thank you to everybody for having me here. This is really a kind of an amazing place. I'd read about it and knew about it, but until you come here, you don't quite get it. I'm not saying I get it now. I'm just saying I get it better. And it also reminds me of some really brilliant advice that my old boss, William F. Buckley, once gave me, which was always travel with your own alcohol. It's amazing they get the joke. And it really was advice he gave. But anyway, so on Liz Cheney, look, I know Liz Cheney personally a little bit. So does my business partner, Steve Hayes, knows her very well because he had written a biography of her dad. And I think that, so let me break it up into a couple of different pieces. I think objectively, on the facts, she's right. She's right about how January 6th was unacceptable, about how the GOP needs to deal with the sort of the bile that has been injected into the institution because of Donald Trump's refusal to accept that he lost. And I think that what she is doing is basically taking one for the team. You know, there's a lot of talk these days about how people think she's going to maybe run for president. I think she might run for president. I don't see how she wins a run for president at this stage. But what is remarkable to me is, look, there are a lot of different theories in the Republican Party about how to deal with Trump. And what I'll often tell people is there's an enormous number of closet normals where they will say things to you when there's no camera around that they will never say if there is a camera around or recording advice. And Liz Cheney, let's just be honest, up until January 6th was a closet normal. She was very supportive of Donald Trump. She played the game like Mitch McConnell largely did, of, you know, bobbing and weaving and not wanting to talk about him all the time. And then for her, January 6th was a Rubicon. And for a lot of other Republicans, they have so habituated themselves to pretending that somebody else will deal with Donald Trump, or pretending that the party hasn't really changed and I can just keep my head down and I can do my things and I can hire young jackasses to do silly things on Twitter and I'll be okay. And Liz Cheney is like, look, if this doesn't tell you that that strategy no longer works, I don't know what will. And so on the one hand, I salute her bravery and her courage, and we're supposed to talk about, you know, courage these days. And I get very, very frustrated with a lot of my friends on the right who will say, look, I don't want Republicans to compromise their principles on important things, but we also have to be practical about political reality. And my view is that if you can't tell the truth about Donald Trump and about what's going on the right, then you have compromised your principles. And the thing, you know, we might get to it, but, you know, one of the reasons I left Fox News after more than a decade was that I could no longer stomach the number of people who would say one thing when the cameras was off and another thing when the cameras were on. And I kind of come from the worldview that says people who are in the business of journalism to one extent or another, their whole job is to tell the truth. And And I think where Liz has sort of been heroic is she's like, okay, I'm done. I'm just going to tell the truth about this stuff. And the party doesn't want to hear it. And the sort of entertainment wing of conservatism doesn't want to hear it. And it breaks my heart in a lot of ways. But I salute her courage.
You know, other than Adam and Kinzinger, so few have followed that example, or normies coming out of the closet. How do you account for that? Did it surprise you? Did you know, we've had so many moments of, most recently, you know, the revelations about what was at Mar-a-Lago of, okay, this is it. This is what is going to break the pattern of people saying one thing in private and another in public, and yet there she is still largely by herself.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's a little bit like Ernest Hemingway's explanation of bankruptcy. It's gradual for a long time, and then it's sudden. There have been a lot of things going on in journalism, in the media, in politics, and I mean this and a lot of it that has been bad on the left side of the spectrum as well too. But I think that one of the so there are a lot of different ways to tackle this. One practical problem was that Donald Trump is utterly immune to criticism. The normal way in politics you get a president to do what you want is you praise them when they do the thing that you want, and you criticize them when they do the thing that you don't want them to do. And the problem is that Donald Trump was only responsive to praise. And if you criticized him, he would go the other way. I mean, like, literally, if there was a giant red button on his desk, and you said to him, under no circumstances, press that button, right? He'd press the button and Kansas would go up in a thermonuclear blast or something. He has this oppositional disorder, and so politicians would go on TV and only praise him, and because that was the only way you could influence him. And over time, that's all the audiences wanted to hear as well. An enormous number of influencers and politicians on the right. There's a famous quote from a French intellectual from the 19th century, who I can never pronounce his name, so I won't, who said, "There go the people, I must go with them, for I am their leader." And there were an enormous number of institutions that were dependent upon large numbers of small donors that went first, or small customers, right? So talk radio, the Heritage Foundation, the GOP. And so once the market went one way, they just followed the market. And then there's all sorts of other issues. I write about this in my book. Part of the problem, and again, this is an American cultural problem, is we tend to follow politics like it's a form of entertainment. And I don't think people, and I'm not saying you're entertained by politics, I mean that your brain processes it like you're watching a movie or a TV show. And there are all sorts of things that happen to your brain when you watch things as entertainment. A hero in a movie can torture people, murder people, shoot people in the face, can do all sorts of things, and so long as you're rooting for that person, you forgive them for it. All you want them to do is win at the end of the movie. And we now tend to follow politics sort of like it's pro wrestling, where, you know, what they call in pro wrestling kayfabe. You're not sure how much of it is real, how much of it is scripted, and how much of it is sort of improv. And, but once you get this mindset that says, I don't really care about the policy, I don't really care about the arguments, I care about my guy winning, you start to forgive all sorts of things. And I'll give you an example. Look, I'm here as a conservative. I am a conservative. I haven't changed. A lot of the people who call themselves conservatives have. I haven't. I was a big critic of Barack Obama. Barack Obama said dozens of times that he was prohibited by the Constitution to unilaterally do DACA for, you know, the Dreamers. He said it couldn't do it. He literally said things like, I'm not a king. I can't do that. The Constitution prevents me. And then when he couldn't get Congress to do it, he did it anyway. And the immediate response from his cheering sections on cable news, on the op-ed pages was, this is fantastic, huge win for Obama. And my reaction was, on his own terms, this guy just said what he was doing was an unconstitutional monarchical act. And even if you agree with the policy, that should raise some concern somewhere. It didn't, among sort of liberal elite types, media types, and all the rest. Donald Trump, you know, he didn't just tweet like an escaped monkey from a cocaine study, right? He did an enormous number of things that violated conservative principles, constitutional principles, that were troubling and problematic. And I would say for 5 years, guys, what is it that the next Democratic president is going to be able to do that you won't be a hypocrite for criticizing if you're not going to criticize any of this stuff? And people didn't care because they cared about the winning. They care about, you know, he's the hero of the story. He is the alpha male, which I still cannot believe people say with a straight face. And they just wanted their hero to win. And that's what you get in a politics that people follow as a form of entertainment, or even at sometimes like a kind of religious existential struggle.
There's so many threads in what you've said that I want to pick up on, but let me start with this last one about the alpha male idea. You have agreed with people like Josh Hawley that there is a masculinity crisis in this country. The problem, you've said, is that the people who are talking most loudly about it are extolling exactly the opposite virtues of the one. So can you talk a little bit about that and what that has meant for our public space and for our politics?
Sure. I should start, I'm a fairly irreverent commentator, but I know this is an august and serious and sober-minded group, so I will avoid going long about Josh Hawley's new book, which is coming out, which is simply called Manhood. I wrote a whole riff about how this is such a gift to hostile critics. You know, like, Josh Hawley's Manhood left me wanting, you know, that kind of thing. That said, you know, there's, so for example, the Claremont Institute, which I used to write for their flagship journal, I've done stuff with them, my wife was a fellow there, I have 20 years of relationships with those guys, and I think they've lost their minds. The chairman of the board of the Claremont Institute recently gave this speech about how Donald Trump is, I mean, and these are like direct quotes, is a manly man. He's a strong man. What we need in these times is a strong, manly man. And this stuff, that kind of talk, just first of all, makes me feel unsafe. People, and second of all, an institution that's supposed to be dedicated to statesmanship, talking about how we need a strong man, is weird to me. But this is the conversation you get all over the place, which is that you have this definition of manhood, which is basically juvenile, puerile, self-serving. It elevates rudeness to virtue. You know, the definition of manhood now says that people like Mitt Romney aren't real men, but people like Matt Gaetz are. And you know, Glenn Beck, who I used to be good friends with, he, a couple years ago, had this whole thing about how the real reason people don't like Donald Trump is that he is the most masculine man we've ever seen in the Oval Office, and that he's basically an American James Bond, and he's the last alpha, and I feel like, you know, I'm taking crazy pills. And this kind of discussion about masculinity, what it does is it takes, I mean, I could get into a long riff about Nietzsche and about how what this is basically what he was writing about in the genealogy of morals, but basically what we're doing is we're taking what were once considered vices and making them virtues. We are taking, and so this guy who's the chairman of the board of the Claremont Institute, he opens by saying, I meet lots of people who say, I love Donald Trump's policies, it's the rest of him I don't like. And his argument is, no, that's exactly backwards. It's that you should like the kind of man that he is, that should be the ideal of manhood, of being rude, of being crude, of being a bully. And to me, this completely inverts, first of all, conservatism is supposed to believe, but also just simply what any notion of sort of Christian virtue or just old-fashioned civic virtue is supposed to believe. What the society doesn't need is strong men, it needs good men. And good men aren't cruel on purpose. Good men don't, boast about their sexual conquests. They don't justify their actions simply because they caused your enemies to cry. And there's become this sort of mean-spirited thing on the right about how liberal tears are delicious and that's all you need to care about. And it's all so performative. And I've probably spoken on 100 college campuses in the last 20 years. I used to be a very popular conservative speaker, no more. But I would always try to tell kids, look, it's great to be controversial. It's great to be anti-PC. But just because being rude isn't politically correct doesn't mean you should be rude. Politics, go back to Aristotle, is supposed to be about persuasion. You're supposed to explain to people why their interests are better represented in your coalition than the one they're currently in. Today, politics is about punitiveness, particularly on the right. It's about, the cruelty is the point. And we're elevating a definition of manliness that, to me, completely inverts what manliness properly understood is, which is supposed to be, well, from my faith tradition, it's called a mensch. Right? You're supposed to do a good thing, you're supposed to do good, have integrity, be decent to people, act as if God is watching you. So, people say character is what you do when nobody else is watching, but one of the great things about monotheism is the concept of God-fearingness, because it takes you out of yourself and makes you think, even though I'm alone and no one can see what I'm doing, God can see what I'm doing, and he might have an opinion about it. And that, I think, is one of the things we've lost in this culture that to our detriment.
So in introducing this week on About Courage in all of its forms, Darren Walker talked about the disincentives to courage, the disincentives to virtue, particularly in our public space. And I'm wondering both how you view those disincentives, particularly the ones that media contributes to, and where you look and find role models and heroes.
This is a tough question. So the incentive structure, again, I think in the world that I come from, the world that you know well, even though you're now in that sort of monastery in Cambridge that looks down on the dark ages of the continent and does what it does. The sort of the infotainment world of inside the Beltway, particularly cable news, and I think cable news, like I'm now at CNN, I was at Fox for 11 years, I think just generally speaking cable news is bad for America. But the incentive structure is, again, in a balkanized, and again, you know this stuff better than I do, but in a balkanized media climate or environment where, it used to be, Walter Cronkite got literally like half the country watching him every night. There was a natural business incentive, structural incentive, not to go to any extremes, because you were speaking to the broad spectrum of the American people. And there were other sources of small c conservatism in this way. Advertisers didn't want to be associated with crazy stuff, right? All that kind of thing. And now, where even the biggest players in the media are looking to get 2, 3, 4% of the market, there's a natural incentive to tell audiences what they want to hear rather than what they need to hear. And it's very powerful. And it happens at the New York Times, and it happens at MSNBC, and it is everything that's going on Fox as far as I'm concerned. And so the incentive structure, and that by definition turns you into a sort of an entertainer, because what you're doing is you are trying to give people what they want from you. And I mean, I cannot tell you how many thousands of people have written me over the last 5 years saying how I betrayed them by not telling them what they wanted to hear. And I would always say, I'm sorry I didn't live down to your expectations. And so I think that is a problem, broadly speaking, about the media environment. And again, this thing about truth-telling. So when in 2015 and 2016, when things started getting weird, I was stunned by how many people I knew that I thought had the same job description as I do, broadly speaking, right? And I wore a lot of different hats. You know, I used to throw around a lot of red meat too, because I was a conservative and, you know, whatever, and it depended on the audience. But I was a think tank guy, I was a book guy, I was a columnist guy, I was a TV pundit guy, and you pitch yourself slightly different to those different kinds of institutions and audiences. But I always just sort of thought that the core job was to tell the truth as you see it. Right? It doesn't mean you have to tell the whole truth. Sometimes it doesn't mean it doesn't mean you can't admit you were wrong about something. And I think that what has happened is, and what astounded me 5, 6 years ago was how many people saw it differently. How many people would come into the Fox green room and say, I can't believe I have to defend this guy. And I'm like, you don't. That's actually not your job. And so that was a real epiphany for me. And so now I tend to find in sort of daily life heroes, you know, what is it, the line from Orwell? Every day, we live in an age where every day just telling the truth is a constant struggle. I can get along with or admire anybody with almost any conceivable point of view imaginable, including like Stalin was the man for his time, right? Whatever it is, as long as you're honest about it, right? As long as you're willing to acknowledge facts and not propagandize. And I've found that there's just the shockingly few, much fewer people willing to do that than I had thought.
But so that leads us to, I think, on the subject of truth, the harder problem. You know, the Pew Research Center has a study that finds that 76% of Americans now think that we can't even agree on basic facts. 26% think that, no, we disagree on policies and issues, but we can agree on basic facts. 76, the missing 1% probably can't agree on whether we can agree. Right? But you're talking about people who know the truth and won't tell it for whatever self-interest. We know from the trials of a lot of the January 6th people who were arrested that many of them absolutely believed that they were doing the right and patriotic thing, that they were acting in the good of the country for the noblest of causes in a self-sacrificial way, which seems to make the many tragedies of that day even more tragic. What do we do with these, I don't even want to say alternative realities because they're not both real, but it is a reality that a lot of the people even that day believed that they were being called to a higher good in the spirit of 1776.
Yeah, so, I mean, the first thing that I think is important to point out is some of these people are idiots. And that doesn't mean you're wrong about their motives, right? And I should also point out, idiot has two, there's a colloquial sense, which, the, idiot who's too stupid to be a spell checker in an M&M factory kind of meaning of, idiot. But the actual word comes from the ancient Greek, and it means somebody who could be very smart, but just doesn't know anything about politics and civic life and notions of the common good. And I think a lot of the people that we're talking about here are more like that. I mean, there's one guy who literally was let go by, was basically acquitted by a judge because the government was saying that he was the mastermind of one of the groups that went into the Capitol. And this guy had posted a video on January 6th touching the Capitol saying, "I'm here, we're here at the White House. This is," and goes on about it. And it's like, not a mastermind, right? And so part of the problem is, again, it gets to this following politics like entertainment. It gets to the thing where the narrative is more important than the facts. And there are con men who know the reality, and they're the ones I'm actually mad at. I actually think the fake electors in Florida and in Georgia are kind of getting screwed. The system's being unfair to them. And there are all sorts of people that I think you can have, that they were just dupes, right? And then there are people like Steve Bannon who, the camera never pans down, so I'm not sure, but I think has hooves. And Steve Bannon, Mother Jones recently got audio of Steve Bannon in October of 2020 saying, here's what's going to happen. Trump's going to lose, and he's going to come out and declare on election night that he won, and he's going to say, screw you to all these people, and he's just going to act like he won, he's going to hold on to power. And he's laughing, and he thinks it's hilarious, and he thinks it's going to be great. And so there are people like Steve Bannon who know what they're doing. They know that they are playing upon the ignorance and misplaced patriotism of a lot of people, and they're filling them up with outrage. And I think it is one of the most profoundly unpatriotic displays in certainly my lifetime. People are deliberately filling the heads of well-intentioned people with lies. And I think it's just profoundly dangerous. But I do think, again, I really do have negative things to say about the left. But I think one of the things that, as a society, that we have a real problem with, and it has a lot of it has to do with the decline of religion in society, and the decline of the family, and the decline of healthy local communities, is that one of the reasons why we're turning to politics as this sort of religious narrative form of entertainment thing is because we are hungering for a sense of community and meaning in this country. This is what the sociologist Robert Nisbet called the quest for community, is that we desperately want to feel like we belong, that we're part of something, that we are respected as individuals, but also part of some sort of greater good. And that is a natural human hunger that doesn't go away. And if you cannot satisfy it the right way, people from time immemorial will try to fill it up with politics. And that's one of the reasons why politics is sort of tracking, partisan affiliation is tracking in this country really like a form of secular religion. For the first time, about 5 years ago, social scientists found that one's partisan affiliation was more predictive of attitudes and behaviors than race, religion, or gender, which is just bonkers when you think about it. But that's what's happening, is that we're taking our partisan identities and coming to the mistaken conclusion that we can fill the holes in our souls with it. And we can't. And that makes us angry. And that makes us fight and cling to this stuff even harder. And I think both sides are guilty of it to one extent or another. I think it is the real source of a lot of Trump's appeal, is this sort of classically, in the Max Weber sense, charismatic form of leadership where the fact that he is so threatening to institutions and the system makes him more appealing, not less. And it's very much like a religious thing. And when you have when religious passions are running high, sort of populist religious passions are running high, it's really hard to say, yeah, but you don't have the facts, or those aren't the numbers. And so I don't know how you fix it. I honestly don't. All I know is that, you know, the way it would be fixed if people started looking elsewhere for meaning and security in their lives than a government, in one branch of the government in Washington. If we stop treating presidents like they are god kings who are symbols of the culture war, and started treating them for what they are, which is the heads of one branch of one level of government in this country. But there's a certain kind of sort of icon worship that we've turned the presidency into, and it's a dangerous thing.
Yeah, I completely agree about politics as secular church, and there's a lot of evidence now that people don't care if their children marry outside of their race or their religion. The only thing that upsets them is if their Democratic son marries a Republican woman, or
it's a mixed marriage.
Right.
Yeah.
But along with that usurpation of politics around everything having to do with what were once sort of protected areas is what the political scientists call affective polarization. It isn't just that I feel really strongly about the tax code or how healthcare should be funded or any policy issues. That what we are seeing is this enormous rise in really negative attitudes towards the other side. And in fact, that the parties are mainly defining themselves by their opposition to the other, which is why we now have the only point of agreement, it seems, that every election now is the most important election, and that the fate of democracy depends on it, which sounds both apocalyptic and all too, accurate. How did it become so personal and emotional and divorced from the normal issues of politics about, how to move the country forward and what are the best tools and levers to pull to improve society?
Yeah, I have my favorite New Yorker cartoon. My wife got blown up and framed for me for my birthday a few years ago, and it is two dogs sitting at a fancy bar in New York in suits and having cocktails, and one dog says to the other, it's not good enough that dogs succeed. Cats must also fail. And both parties are basically the cats must also fail party, right? They care more about the other side losing than their own side winning. And I got to say, look, I mean, this is somewhere I don't want to get deep in a rabbit hole about sort of liberal media bias and all of that, but this is part of the gradual then sudden problem. The mainstream media did a lot to earn distrust from a lot of people in this country, and so did a lot of other elite institutions. And I think that, and one of the terrible things about Twitter and social media generally is put it on steroids, right? It is amped it up both in intensity and in cycle. But like my colleague at the American Enterprise Institute, Yuval Levin, has in a wonderful book called Fractured Republic, makes this argument that one of the defining problems with our culture is that people use institutions now as platforms to perform upon rather than to mold character. And he says, when you think about it, what is an institution? It's something that subordinates the individual towards a greater purpose. Classic example would be like the Marines, right? Where you go in a damn hippie and you come out a Marine, right? The Boy Scouts, Go in as a wild kid, you come out an Eagle Scout who makes his bed and helps the little ladies across the street. You're molding character. That's what institutions are supposed to do. And now we live in a time where people have no respect for the role of the institution or their role within the institution, and instead they use it as a platform for their own cult of personality, their own celebrity. Look, Colin Kaepernick may have been 1,000% right about the issues of police brutality. That's not my point. He used the NFL as a platform for his issues. You have countless journalists who use their association with various institutions as a way to magnify their own personal brand. Elizabeth Holmes, you go down a very long list of people that's nothing to do with politics, where they're using the institutions not as leaders, but as megaphones for themselves. And that's one of the things that Donald Trump did, right? He used the presidency as an institution for his own personal needs and his own personal cult of personality and his own celebrity, rather than, as Yuval says, the first rule of any leader of an institution should be to ask, what is my role here? What am I supposed to be doing here? And, and there were a lot of people who thought Donald Trump was going to pivot and become presidential, and it was like waiting for Godot, right? And so I think that one of the problems we have with a lot of institutions in this country, including a lot of elite liberal institutions, because liberals do control the commanding heights of the culture, is they use their institutions for their own pet needs. They think they have to speak out on everything. My favorite example of this is that every year at the Oscars, you have one movie star after another who gets up there in front of an incredibly friendly audience that agrees with them, and they say things hostile about people who aren't in the audience. They urinate on red state America from a great height, and they get celebrated for their courage and bravery in speaking truth to power when the audience is eating it up. And normal Americans, they see this. They see the way in which people have been using elite institutions as a way to make fun of or denigrate or condescend to rank and file Americans. I personally think that one of the reasons we're here is because the media and the Democrats handled the Tea Parties so terribly that it basically caused a kind of psychic break, where you had a bunch of people, like, I hate populism, I've always criticized populism, but this was like the one populist movement I could maybe get behind, because it was the one long foretold, a libertarian populist movement that seizes power and then leaves everybody alone, right? They carried around the Constitution, they talked about getting back to basics, living within our means, and they were still called just an undifferentiated mob of racists and kooks and fascists and all of these things. And I think for a lot of them, they were like, look, it doesn't matter what we do or say, they're going to call us deplorables and treat us like deplorables, so we might as well act like it. And the faith and confidence in the other side showing the right good faith was completely lost. The problem with that is it now gives the right permission structure to be jerks. And it's like, take this thing from the news. Let's say it is absolutely true that the FBI should have prosecuted Hillary Clinton for how she handled her email server and all of that kind of stuff. In what way does the fact that the FBI didn't do what it was supposed to do with Hillary Clinton mean that it's okay for Donald Trump to do what he's doing? We live in this sort of two wrongs make a right universe now, where as long as you can prove the other side is hypocritical, that allows you to live down to the lowest common denominator that allows you to behave the way you imagine the other side is behaving. And it's a very eye for an eye kind of way of thinking about the world. Either good character means something independent upon whether or not Democrats show it, or it doesn't. And if good character is now defined in partisan terms, then by definition, no one knows what good character is anymore.
So, in this context, up in my elitist monastery, there's a lot of academic debate about the need for basic structural reform. That we cannot continue with the Electoral College as it is, that you can't have the 50 Democratic senators representing 41 million more people than the 50 Republican senators, all the way through the system. Your colleague David French, who spoke last summer, talked about the need for a new kind of federalism and a return of power to more local. Do any of these, to you, promise a way out of this pitched battle that we find ourselves in?
Yeah, so the jungle primary stuff, I think, has real potential. If you look, there are only, of the 2 Republican House members that voted for impeachment, of the 10 who voted for impeachment, the 2 who survived their primaries, it was in jungle primaries, where jungle primaries basically, you have a round where everybody runs in one primary regardless of whether they're Republican or Democrat, and then the top 2 or 3 finishers do a second round. And it's a way to get around the captivity of the primaries by the bases of both parties in a lot of places. I think there's potential there. Personally, I would get rid of primaries entirely. I think primaries have done enormous damage to our country. We are the only advanced industrialized democracy in the world whose parties voluntarily gave up the ability to pick their own candidates. And so instead we have these, and it worked out fine for a while, but now in the era of the big sort and polarization, the old pattern of like running to the base of your party for the primary and then running to the middle during the general is gone. Because the only way for hundreds of elected officials, the only way you're going to lose in a safe red or a safe blue district is if you lose a primary, because you're going to win the general election no matter what. And I think a lot of our problems in this country have to do with weak parties, not strong parties. Weak parties create strong partisanship because people outsource party functions to other institutions and to individuals to do the work that the parties themselves should be doing. If the parties had a long-term fiduciary interest in protecting their reputations and their brands, they would have behaved a lot different in the last few election cycles. But they're now basically, as my friend Ross Douthat likes to say, both parties are basically like fueled jets sitting on the runway waiting to be hijacked. And Bernie Sanders almost succeeded in 2016. Donald Trump did. And so I think strengthening parties would make a lot of sense. But I very much do not want to get rid of the Electoral College. I think that is sort of a red herring. I think whether you guys in your labs in Cambridge can game out some sort of scenario where you get rid of the Senate's nature, how that can happen, how you are going to get a bunch of senators to basically vote to, in essence, abolish the Senate seems unlikely to me, and I think it is an enormous waste of time. I also just don't think it's undemocratic to have states represented by, in a different body, by the same number of representatives. This was the grand compromise at the founding, and there's always a tell when you hear people talk about the Electoral College. Not always, but it's common. Is they always talk about California versus Wyoming, right?
Not Vermont.
Right. They never say Florida versus Vermont, right? And there are just as many small blue states that benefit from the Senate as there are small red states that benefit from the Senate. And so I think that is a siren song for people to get all worked up about, but I just don't know how you could actually amend the Constitution in a way that abolishes the nature of the Senate and how it selects people, selects members in any way that is a worthwhile use of everybody's energy and passion.
This is my last question, because I know there are a lot of people who want to pull on all sorts of threads, but you wrote recently that you think a lot of people on the left are not just, this is about will the Republican Party, is it moving on past Trump, and that there is a large group of people who are waiting for sort of mass atonement
Right.
And that is unrealistic, that's not how this is going to end, and that's not how we're going to move forward. Can you talk about that a little?
Yes. Look, as someone who lost a lot of money, a lot of friends, a lot of jobs because of my approach to these issues, I very much would like a Claude Rains moment, like at the end of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, where a bunch of people admit they were wrong, that Mr. Smith was right about everything, and they throw themselves on the feet of people begging for forgiveness. I'd even settle for Colonel Nicholson from Bridge on a River Kwai, quietly muttering, "My God, what have I done?" as he collapses dead on a dynamite plunger. None of these scenarios are going to happen. As a friend of mine was pointing out the other day, Ronald Reagan didn't go around beating the stuffing out of Richard Nixon and Watergate. They just moved on. And I think that the way the Republican Party moves on is by moving on. And that's one of the downsides of this Mar-a-Lago search thing, which I think politically, there are a lot of people who I disagree with about a lot of stuff are right, it helps Trump. I think it's crazy that it should help Trump, but it helps Trump. And the way the party moves on is by simply saying it's time for somebody new. And I think it's so weird that people think it makes so much sense to elect a guy who on day one would be a lame duck president that would, further polarize the entire country. And, even if you don't share my other views about Donald Trump, what I hope is that the fever goes away. Because I care much more about the transformation of rank-and-file Republicans who I've spent my entire life speaking to audiences, hanging out with audiences, being around like normal, decent American citizens, many of whom now I think are enthralled or ensorcelled or brainwashed by a crazy narrative about what's going on with America that makes it normal to say the FBI is the Gestapo because it carried out a lawful warrant, right? That makes it normal to talk about how we need civil war. And that fever, I feel, has become more institutionalized in the GOP. I mean, it breaks my heart that on the right broadly, Mitt Romney, Liz Cheney, Jeff Flake, people like that are more of a pariah, more unwelcome on the main stage at CPAC, more unwelcome on the ballot in a Republican race than people who prattle on about Jewish space lasers and in some cases, basically dabble with Holocaust denial and all of that kind of stuff. And when you criticize those people, they say, well, we need to be a big tent. We need there are a lot of views in the GOP, but the views that they think need to be part of the coalition, that can be members in the big tent, are views of people who have really, in some cases, truly evil positions. And people who say unleashing a mob on the Capitol on January 6th was an outrage and Trump deserved to be impeached for it, they say, yeah, you're not part of the party anymore, you don't belong here. And too many of people who buy into that garbage, who talk like that, who think like that, have achieved positions of power and control in various parties. It kind of like the state of Arizona. I think Doug Ducey is a great governor, but the state of Arizona is bonkers now. And it kind of reminds me. There's a great scene in The Simpsons where 20 years in the future, Marge and Homer are watching Fox, the Fox channel that The Simpsons is on, and you can see them illuminated from behind the TV as they're watching TV in bed as an old couple, and Marge just turns to Homer and says, "Homie, it's just amazing. Fox's transformation into a 24-hour porn channel was so gradual, I hardly even noticed. That's how I feel when I turn on the TV a lot these days, and it's not real porn, but it's political porn, and that's going to have a half-life. That is going to take a while to work itself out of the system, and there's a reason why God told Moses to keep people in the wilderness for a while. The problem is that the Democratic Party's a hot mess too. It's not symmetrical. It's not the morally problematic thing that what's going on with the GOP, but the Democratic Party has lost its rationale for its coalition in a lot of ways, and I could definitely see one of these two parties dying. And the cats must fail thing kicks in. In an era of negative polarization, if the reason for one party to exist is because people hate the other party so much, when one party dies, the other party loses its reason to live. And I can see us having a major scrambling of the nature. They'll still probably be called Republicans and Democrats, but what they stand for and what they are could be very different in 10 years' time. And that would probably be a good thing.
All right. Jonah, thank you. Turn back the floor to you.
Thank you both very much. For those of you who are leaving for other programs, I suggest you stay, actually. We ask that you do so quietly until you have left the amphitheater out of respect for those who are staying. If you have questions, you may submit them through our ushers who are circulating and can provide slips of paper and pencils. You may also submit questions online at questions.chq.org or on Twitter via the hashtag CHQ2022. I'm going to throw these out here, and you're both invited to jump on them if you'd like. If not, they're probably Jonah's. On the topic of courage, how should we think about the individual acts we can take to save our democracy?
So there's a controversy about who originally said it. It's been attributed to Maya Angelou, Cicero, C.S. Lewis, Winston Churchill, and Dr. Johnson. So go whichever way you want with that. But this proposition that courage is the most important virtue because it is the expression of all of the other virtues at their testing point. Without courage, the other virtues don't really matter because people won't defend or support them. And so I think the problem is, one of the problems we have in our culture is that if people behave courageously, they want all sorts of praise for it. And real courage is just doing the right thing in the day-to-day life that's the right thing. And not being needlessly cruel, not being mean, not being a bully, not lying. Alexander Solzhenitsyn says you can live your life with integrity. You can even allow the lie to come into the world, but you can resolve that it won't come through me. And so I think there's nothing wrong with this country that a virtuous and decent people doesn't fix over time. And I do think that at the end of the day, we are still a virtuous and decent people. I think the one thing that we need most in this culture is gratitude. I believe that conservatism, rightly understood, depends on gratitude. Because what gratitude is it basically says, you look at the world as it is, the world that you have inherited, and you say, these things are lovely. These things have value. I want my children to have these things. Therefore, they must be conserved. And these things can be all sorts of different things. But we don't teach gratitude in this country anymore. We teach a form of entitlement. that says you're owed something, that you have a right to be pissed off because of an accident of birth. And I think that attitude, which is all over the place, is really dangerous to democracy. This is the greatest country, the most prosperous country, the freest country in the history of the world, bar none. And people look at you the way my basset hound would look at me when I tried to feed it a grape, with like total unblinking incomprehension that you might want to point out that this is a good and decent country, that we've done a lot of great and glorious things in this country. Doesn't mean we don't have flaws, doesn't mean we haven't made mistakes, but we've done so much to fix and remedy our mistakes. Have a little gratitude for that, and gratitude can be infectious. And I think it's one of the things that's completely lost in the conversation.
What's the responsibility that the left has in our age of deep polarization? What must the left confront when Trump is an easy target for all of our problems?
Do you want to? No? All right. I just feel bad filibustering here. That's a smart lady who knows a lot of things.
Including when to shut up.
Well, I'll try to keep this brief. Try to keep it brief, as Henry VIII said to each of his wives. I won't keep you long. I think part of my answer about gratitude is something that the left needs to rediscover. That, you know, one of the reasons I wrote Suicide of the West the way I did is I wanted to persuade people who disagreed with me about important facts about politics and policy, right? That's sort of the life I've chosen because I'm an idiot. And so the first sentence of the book is, there is no God in this book. And I didn't say that because I'm an atheist. I said it because if you're going to argue, if you're going to try to persuade people to, you know, of the progressive left to love this country and love the miracle of the American founding and the Enlightenment and all of these kinds of things, you can't appeal to an authority that they think isn't necessarily a legitimate authority. And so what I tried to do is demonstrate that if you ask a normal progressive person, what is politics for? What is government for? They'll tell you a bunch of things. Relieving poverty, relieving ignorance, education, public health, the common good, all of these various things. Liberal democratic capitalism has done more on all of those fronts than anything else in human history to improve the state of humanity. And you should have a little gratitude for it and recognize it. And it's very difficult to get people, there's so much catastrophism overtaking the left and right these days, who sort of don't want to hear that things aren't as bad as they think. They want to be apocalyptic and everything. Stop it. Beyond that, I think that as a much more practical, down-to-earth response, stop helping the worst actors in the Republican Party because you think they'll be easier to beat. It is grotesquely cynical. It's one of the reasons why Trump got the nomination in 2016. It's one of the reasons why, it's like parties have done this for a long time, of trying to pick weaker opponents by meddling in the other side's stuff. I get it. But you can't simultaneously say that the election denier crowd is an existential threat to democracy. Our country hangs in the balance. Democracy could be over, but Nancy Pelosi's super PAC is going to help kill Republicans who voted for impeachment. You can't lament that these guys were courageous and heroic and they did the right thing against their profiles and courage when they did it, and then say, but we're going to help their primary opponent because that guy will be easier to beat. And a lot of the media coverage is addicted to Donald Trump for similar reasons, is that they are high on constant Trump coverage, and it helps Trump. It is a symbiotic negative relationship between left and right, is that both sides are sort of addicted to the worst versions of themselves. Both sides love picking up, my colleague David French calls it nut picking, where the right picks up, the craziest left-winger, like Medusa's skull, and said, see, this is what they're all like. And then the left picks up the craziest people on the right and says, see, this is what they're all right. It's a way to justify yourself as a hero by picking the enemies that you want, rather than trying to be constructive about how you actually fix problems and model the behavior that you actually want to see in politics.
The only thing I would add to that, I guess, is what I would love to see our campuses learn from Chautauqua. I think that the issue about speech on campus and the willingness to create the space to argue and play devil's advocate and be exposed to ideas that you find offensive is so critically important to learning and to getting smarter so that you then can go out and solve problems. And I think the traditions that we have been honoring this week, that we always honor in this institution, really need to be restored and revived in all of our centers of learning and all of our institutions, because that is critically important to finding the solutions that we need.
Yeah, I agree. I think the way the left celebrated the riots in 2018 after George Floyd, or gave them a wide moral berth, was outrageous and counterproductive. I think the way in which a lot of, on campuses and elite institutions, this argument that speech is violence, but violence is speech, pets the cat backwards on 300 years of Western liberalism. That violence is violence and speech is speech, and if you're going to treat speech as legitimate, if you're going to treat speech as illegitimate violence and violence as legitimate speech, we are going back to the days prior to the Peace of Westphalia. And it's just a terrible idea, and it's all over the place on the left and the right.
Seems like the country needs more political parties to break its polarity. Is that impossible here? And another questioner asked for your thoughts on Andrew Yang's new party.
So the classic statement on third parties in America is from the progressive historian Richard Hofstadter, who said that third parties are like bees. They have their effect by stinging and then they die. And if you go back to 1912, where the worst president of the 20th century was elected, at least I'll make that argument another time, the Bull Moose Party screwed the Republican Party and got the Democrats elected. Ross Perot, Ralph Nader. The problem with third parties is they tend to affect the parties they're most similar to detrimentally. And there's one area of bipartisanship where bipartisanship in America is thriving and robust and healthy and collegial, and that is the duopoly of the two parties to be the only two parties in town that matter. And the way they have written election laws to privilege just Republicans and Democrats is profound. And when you have the structural issues in our system called first past the post, where all you need is a simple majority to win, the multiplicity of parties paradigm that comes with parliamentary systems just doesn't make much sense here. And so you'd have to do a whole bunch of sweeping reforms to how we do elections to make a multi-party system work very well.
We have lots and lots of questions. We have little or no time. This has been engaging and challenging and thought-provoking. We thank you, Jonah and Nancy, very much for being here. And we know one of you will be back often, and we hope the other one will also.
CHQ Assembly is made possible through the collaboration and innovation of Chautauqua Institution's full-time and part-time staff, seasonal staff, and many volunteers, as well as participants like you, whose engagement, gifts, and subscriptions sustain our mission.